Revenge isn't
I will have
always
my
a storm of
revenge.
fury. Sometimes it's a chilling whisper in a stolen melody, an echo in a silent garden, or the slow unraveling of a stolen legacy. Tonight, we present 5 tales where retribution finds its own quiet, unsettling, and often supernatural path. If you believe that some wrongs demand a reckoning, however subtle, show your support with a like and subscribe for more stories where justice, in its own time, is served. There are echoes in this world, resonances of lives lived and art created that linger far beyond the grasp of mortal hands. Some are born of joy, others of deep sorrow, and some, it is said, carry the quiet, persistent weight of an injustice that time itself cannot erase. This is a tale of such an echo, a melody of revenge played not with fury, but with a chilling, insidious grace. Her name was Elara Thorne, a composer of gentle heart and prodigious, if largely unacknowledged, talent. She lived a quiet life, her world an intimate symphony of notes and nuanced emotions. Her compositions more often heard by the rustling leaves outside her window than by any grand audience. Yet within her resided a singular genius for melody, an ability to weave sound into tapestries that could soothe the most troubled soul. Her masterpiece, the culmination of years of quiet dedication, was a lullaby she called Starlight Serene. It was unlike any lullaby a child had heard before. It wasn't merely a string of simple, repetitive notes. Starlight Serene was an intricate yet profoundly calming piece, its melody like cool water flowing over smooth stones, its harmonies like the gentle unfolding of twilight. It held a unique magic, a serene power to quiet fretful infants, to ease the anxieties of restless children, and even to bring a measure of peace to adults burdened by the day's cares. For Elara, it was more than music. It was a piece of her soul, her most earnest hope for bringing a little gentleness into a harsh world. She dreamt of it being shared, of its quiet comfort reaching far and wide. Into Elara's small secluded world came Silas Blackwood. He was a contemporary, a composer too. But where Elara possessed quiet depth, Silas exuded a polished charisma and a burning, overt ambition. His own compositions, while technically competent, lacked the spark, the innate emotional resonance that flowed so effortlessly from Elara. He encountered Starlight Serene at a small, informal gathering of local musicians, a rare occasion where Elara, persuaded by a close friend, had shared her latest work. Silas was effusive in his praise, his eyes alight with what Elara mistook for genuine admiration. He spoke of its unique beauty, its profound emotional depth. He asked to see the sheet music, claiming a desire to study its structure, to learn from her artistry. Elara, humble and trusting, obliged. Weeks later, the world was introduced to a new, sensational lullaby. It was called Celestial Dream, composed, the papers and radio announced, by the rising star, Silas Blackwood. The melody was slightly rephrased, a few harmonies subtly altered, a more bombastic orchestral arrangement added, but to anyone who had heard Elara's original, the soul of Starlight Serene was undeniably, heartbreakingly present. Celestial Dream became an overnight sensation. It was played in nurseries, featured in films, its melody a constant, soothing presence on the airwaves. Silas Blackwood was lauded as a genius, a master of tranquil soundscapes. Elara was devastated. It wasn't just the theft of her music, but the perversion of its intent, the loss of its quiet soul under Silas's grandiose treatment. She tried to protest, to make her claim known. She wrote letters, contacted publishers, spoke to fellow musicians, but Silas, now enveloped in the warm glow of fame and critical acclaim, easily dismissed her. She was painted as a bitter, unknown artist, envious of another's success. With no significant public profile, and only a few friends who knew the truth of her original composition. Her quiet voice was drowned out by the chorus of Silas's triumph. Her spirit, as gentle and delicate as her lullaby, began to fray. She composed less and less, the joy of creation overshadowed by profound, gnawing sorrow. Alara Thorne faded further into obscurity, and a few years later passed away quietly. Her true genius uncelebrated, her heart broken by a world that had unknowingly embraced her stolen song. Years turned into a decade. Silas Blackwood continued to reap the rewards of Celestial Dream. It was the bedrock of his career, the peace that defined him. He lived a life of comfort and renown. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. It started with his live performances. During orchestral renditions of Celestial Dream, an inexplicably sour note would sometimes mar the otherwise perfect harmony. A fleeting dissonance that would make Silas wince, though many in the audience seemed not to notice, or attributed it to a minor orchestral slip. Then listeners of the recorded versions began to report a strange phenomenon. Beneath the familiar soothing layers of the lullaby, some claimed to hear other sounds. A faint, almost inaudible sigh. A whisper like rustling silk, or a single, melancholic note that didn't belong, creating a subtle undercurrent of unease. Parents noticed that children who once drifted off peacefully to Celestial Dream now sometimes woke from unsettling dreams. Not nightmares filled with monsters, but dreams tinged with strange, inexplicable sadness or a quiet anxiety. The alterations, once fleeting and easily dismissed, grew more pronounced, more persistent. The lullaby, Silas's golden creation, began to curdle. Its once unwavering ability to soothe was now frequently replaced by an ability to evoke a palpable sense of sorrow, of unspoken regret, even a quiet, creeping dread in those who listened too closely. The magic was souring, turning inward. For Silas, the experience was a personal torment. He heard the discordant notes, the sorrowful undertones more clearly, more intensely than anyone. His acclaimed performances became fraught with anxiety. He'd conduct with a desperate tension, trying to force the orchestra to override the phantom sounds only he seemed to fully perceive. He grew paranoid, suspecting saboteurs in his orchestra, flaws in concert hall acoustics, or even a decline in his own hearing. His reputation began to suffer. Critics noted a new, unsettling quality in his signature piece, a disturbing melancholia that had replaced its former serenity. He commissioned new recordings, employed the finest sound engineers, all in a desperate attempt to fix the lullaby, to exorcise the unwelcome elements that had latched onto it. But each new master, each pristine pressing, would inevitably, after a short time, succumb. The sighing whispers, the discordant notes, the pervasive aura of sadness would always creep back in, as if woven into the very fabric of the melody by an unseen sorrowful hand. The public, once enamored, began to turn away. Celestial Dream, The lullaby that had once promised peaceful slumber was now whispered about as the weeping song or Silas's sorrow. Sales plummeted. Radio stations quietly dropped it from their playlists. Silas Blackwood, the celebrated composer, found himself increasingly isolated, haunted by the beautiful, corrupted music he had stolen. He could no longer bear to hear it, yet its twisted refrains seemed to echo constantly in the recesses of his mind, a tormenting reminder of his deceit. His career crumbled, not with a bang, but with the slow, agonizing decay of his stolen prize. His peace of mind was irrevocably shattered. He lived out his remaining years as a recluse, his grand house filled with a heavy silence, a silence he preferred to the beautiful, heartbreaking sound of the lullaby that had both made and unmade him. Ilara Thorne's spirit, it seems, never sought a loud or violent vengeance. There were no spectral condemnations, no dramatic curses. Instead, her revenge was as subtle and pervasive as her music had once been. She hadn't destroyed Silas. She had simply reclaimed her song, allowing its inherent truth, its stolen soul, to slowly, methodically, dismantle the false edifice of his success. The Stolen Lullaby, once a beacon of pirated peace, became its own quiet, sorrowful, and profoundly effective retribution. It became a haunting melody of justice, a chilling testament to the enduring power of a silenced truth. The subtle cruelties of youth often leave scars unseen, wounds that fester in the quiet corners of a young heart. But sometimes, the echoes of such unkindness find a way to reverberate, to manifest in ways that defy simple explanation, serve a form of justice as chilling as it is poetic. This is a tale of such an echo, where the tormentor found himself haunted by the very art of the one he tormented. Mark Rylance was the king of his small high school corridor, not through overt physical dominance, but through a more insidious brand of power. He was handsome, popular, and possessed a sharp, cutting wit that he wielded with casual cruelty. His targets were usually the quiet ones, the different ones, those who wouldn't, or couldn't, fight back in a conventional sense. His bullying wasn't about black eyes or stolen lunch money. It was about targeted ridicule that spread like wildfire. The cold shoulder of social isolation, the sly exploitation of carefully observed insecurities, a slow, meticulous dismantling of a person's self-worth. His latest focus was Liam Asher. Liam was an anachronism in the boisterous halls of Northwood High. He was introspective, almost unnervingly quiet, preferring the company of his worn sketchbook to that of his peers. In his pages, Liam created a menagerie of unique, slightly unsettling creatures. They weren't monsters in the traditional sense. No fangs or claws or dripping gore. Instead, they were beings of symbolic strangeness, entities with too many eyes that seemed to follow you off the page, creatures with asymmetrical fluid forms that defied earthly biology, beings that appeared woven from shadow and whispered secrets. They were eerie, certainly, but also possessed a strange, melancholic beauty, reflections of a mind that saw the world through a different lens. The incident that tipped the scales, that perhaps awakened something, was not Mark's most grandiose act of cruelty, but it was one of his most personal. Liam had poured weeks into an art project, a diorama, meticulously crafting a scene populated by several of his unique sketched creatures, each formed from clay and delicate wire. It was for Liam a rare offering of his inner world. Mark, Finding Liam alone in the art room during lunch didn't physically destroy it. Instead, with a few well-chosen, venomous words spoken with a smirk to a couple of his acolytes, he belittled it, mocked its strangeness, and, with a final, dismissive flick of his wrist, accidentally knocked a container of turpentine over the delicate centerpiece, ruining weeks of Liam's painstaking work. He then led the laughter as Liam, face pale, silently gathered the sodden, ruined figures, his shoulders slumped in quiet devastation. Liam offered no outward retaliation, no angry outburst. He simply retreated further into himself, his sketchbook becoming his only confidant. A few days later, Mark started seeing things. It began subtly, a flicker in his peripheral vision as he walked down the school hallway, a shadow in his bedroom at night that seemed to move with an unnatural fluidity when he wasn't looking directly at it. He was used to being the one who made others jumpy. The reverse was a new and unwelcome sensation. He dismissed it naturally, as stress from upcoming exams or just his imagination playing tricks. But the fleeting glimpses didn't stop. They grew more distinct. And then, with cold lurch in his stomach, Mark began to recognize them. The strange shapes, the unsettling forms. They were the creatures from Liam Asher's sketchbook. He'd see them in reflections. Glancing at a darkened classroom window as he passed, he'd see not his own reflection, but for a split second, one of Liam's many-eyed beings staring back, its gaze unnervingly knowing. In the bathroom mirror at home, when the steam cleared, sometimes the faint outline of an asymmetrical, shadowy creature would linger for a moment before fading. They never spoke, never moved to attack. They just watched, their silent, symbolic presence more unnerving than any overt threat. Sometimes he'd find faint, sketch-like marks on fogged-up surfaces or in the dust on his desk, resembling the creatures, only for them to vanish when he tried to touch them or show anyone else. The torment soon bled into his nights. His dreams became populated by these strange entities. They wouldn't chase him or enact violence. Instead, they would silently surround him, replaying his acts of bullying against Liam, not as accusations, but as quiet, irrefutable tableaus. He would see himself sneering, hear his own cruel words echoed back by unseen voices, all while Liam's sketch creatures bore silent, judgmental witness. Other times, they would simply be there in his dreamscape, their too numerous eyes fixed on him. Their very presence a crushing weight. During the day, his once unshakable confidence began to erode. He became jumpy, irritable. He started hearing faint, dry whispers when no one else was around, or a soft, skittering sound from the corners of rooms. Sounds he instinctively associated with the encroaching presence of the creatures. His grades began to slip. His friends, noticing his distraction and paranoia, started to drift away. Unsure how to deal with his increasingly erratic behavior, he was becoming isolated, a chilling mirror of the social exile he had so expertly orchestrated for Liam. He couldn't describe what he was seeing or hearing to anyone. How could he explain being haunted by drawings without sounding completely unhinged? One afternoon in the library, he saw Liam at a table, sketching. Drawn by a morbid, fearful curiosity, Mark found an excuse to walk past, glancing at Liam's open sketchbook. There they were, the very same creatures that populated his waking anxieties and his dreaming terrors. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. These weren't random apparitions. They were Liam's. Somehow, Liam's art, his silent pain, had found a way to seep into Mark's reality. He thought about confronting Liam, demanding he stop, whatever it was he was doing. But what could he say? Accuse him of witchcraft? Of drawing his nightmares into existence? Liam himself remained as quiet and withdrawn as ever, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil Mark was experiencing, or perhaps, Mark thought with a fresh wave of dread, he was subtly, silently aware. Driven more by a desperate need for the visitations to cease than by any genuine remorse, Mark found his bullying tendencies waning. The thought of singling out Liam or anyone else now filled him with a new kind of fear. The fear that his spectral entourage might grow, but the creatures didn't disappear immediately. Their presence became a constant low hum of anxiety in his life. The revenge, if one could call it that, was not a direct act of retribution from Liam. It was something far more insidious, more personal. The creatures born from Liam's imagination, from his quiet suffering, did not seek to physically harm Mark. Their purpose, it seemed, was to make him inhabit the very emotional landscape he had so callously created for another. They forced him to confront his own cruelty, mirrored back at him through their unsettling silent forms. It was a slow, psychological unraveling, a haunting by the echoes of his own unkindness. The narrator, presumably myself, in this deep, storytelling voice, might reflect here. True vengeance doesn't always arrive with thunder and fury. Sometimes it whispers from the pages of a sketchbook, taken root in the conscience of the tormentor, a quiet, relentless siege. Mark Rylance was never quite the same. The apparitions, the whispers, they did eventually fade, their visits becoming less frequent, less distinct, as Mark, humbled and genuinely changed by the experience, began to treat those around him with a newfound, tentative empathy. Whether they vanished because he had learned his lesson, or because the wellspring of Liam's silent, artistic pain had found some measure of peace, no one could say. But Mark carried the memory of those unsettling eyes, those symbolic forms, for the rest of his days. A permanent, chilling reminder that art can hold power, that emotions can take shape, and that sometimes the most profound justice is the kind that forces you to see the world and your own actions through the eyes of those you've wronged. Some promises, once made, seep into the very fabric of a place, into its timber and stone, its dust and shadows. They become a silent vow, an unseen guardian, and when such a promise is broken, the retribution that follows may not be loud or violent, but a slow, inexorable tide of resistance. A quiet, chilling revenge enacted by the house itself. This is the story of Oakhaven, and the pledge that refused to be forgotten. Oakhaven stood on a gentle rise overlooking Willow Creek, a grand dame of a house from a bygone era. It wasn't merely a structure of wood and brick. It was a repository of generations, its rooms filled with the faint scent of beeswax, old books, and a century of lived-in memories. Its gardens, though a little wild in their later years, still held the ghost of a formal beauty. Its last resident was Mrs. Eleanor Ainsworth, an elderly woman whose life had been almost entirely contained within Oakhaven's walls. She was as much a part of the house as its hand-carved newel posts or its sun-dappled, wavy glass windows. Selling it was, for her, like parting with a piece of her soul, a decision born only of necessity and the quiet insistence of her advancing years. Into this delicate situation stepped Mr. Silas Thorne. Thorne was a man of modern ambitions, a developer whose vision rarely extended beyond profit margins and minimalist chic. He saw Oakhaven not as a legacy, but as prime real estate, an outdated structure ripe for a lucrative transformation. He approached Mrs. Ainsworth with a practiced charm, speaking eloquently of his deep admiration for the home's history, its unique character, its irreplaceable craftsmanship. He painted himself as a kindred spirit, a lover of heritage. Mrs. Ainsworth, frail but sharp, listened intently. She had turned away other offers from those who spoke too readily of demolition or stark modernization. But Thorne's words, carefully chosen, resonated with her deepest wish for Oakhaven's future. She agreed to sell, but only on one condition, extracted from him as a solemn, heartfelt pledge, witnessed by her solicitor and perhaps by the very spirit of the house itself. He was to preserve Oakhaven, to be its custodian, to honor its history, not to erase it. Thorne, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of acquisition, readily agreed, his voice smooth with sincerity. The papers were signed. A week after Mrs. Ainsworth moved into a small sterile apartment across town, a move that seemed to diminish her spirit almost visibly. Silas Thorne's true intentions for Oakhaven were unveiled. His team of architects and contractors arrived, not with plans for careful restoration, but with blueprints detailing a radical gutting. The historic interiors were to be ripped out, replaced with open-plan living spaces, glass and steel. The beloved rambling garden was to be leveled for a minimalist patio and a multi-car garage. Of his solemn pledge to Mrs. Ainsworth, Thorne merely scoffed to his foreman. Old sentiment. Business is business. Some say Mrs. Ainsworth, upon hearing whispers of his plans through concerned former neighbors, simply turned her face to the wall and faded away within a month, her heart finally broken by the betrayal. And then Oakhaven began to resist. The initial attempts at renovation were met with a series of small, inexplicable, and intensely frustrating hindrances. Workers' tools, laid down for a moment, would vanish, only to reappear hours later in the most absurd or inaccessible locations. A heavy sledgehammer, needed to break down an interior wall, was found perfectly balanced atop the delicate dusty chandelier in the dining room. A state-of-the-art laser measuring device would be found nestled deep within the cold, disused chimney of the old kitchen hearth. Blueprints, left secured on drafting tables overnight, would be found in the morning with subtle, maddening alterations. A crucial load-bearing wall would be indicated as a quarter-inch off from the previous day's careful measurements. Window specifications would be inexplicably changed to match the original, centuries-old designs rather than the modern replacements. Chalk lines snapped on floors would be smudged or entirely gone, as if wiped away by an unseen hand. Modern power tools, fresh from their cases, would sputter and die without cause the moment they were brought to bear against Oakhaven's old bones. Batteries would drain in minutes. Electronic stud finders would give wildly erratic readings or simply refuse to turn on. Yet an old hand-cranked drill, found in a forgotten toolbox in the cellar and tried by a frustrated carpenter out of sheer desperation, worked perfectly. Its ancient mechanism turning with a smooth, almost eager whir. Silas Thorne, initially dismissive, blaming shoddy workmanship or petty sabotage, grew increasingly agitated as the delays mounted and costs began to spiral. The project, meant to be a swift and profitable venture, was quickly becoming a quagmire of bizarre misfortune. The resistance escalated. New high-quality materials brought onto the site seemed to fall victim to an inexplicable, premature decay. Freshly applied coats of expensive, modern paint would peel and blister overnight, revealing the old patterned wallpaper beneath, seemingly mocking Thorne's attempts at erasure. Bundles of prime lumber, intended for new framing, would warp or develop strange dark stains, reminiscent of old water damage, despite being stored correctly in dry conditions. The construction crew, a hardened group of men not easily spooked, became increasingly unsettled. They started to whisper amongst themselves. They reported feeling watched, an oppressive, sorrowful presence in rooms marked for demolition. They'd hear faint sighs like a disappointed breath whenever they discussed altering a particularly beloved feature of the old house, like the ornate fireplace in the library or the stained glass window on the main landing that Mrs. Ainsworth had cherished. Sudden bone-chilling cold spots would materialize in areas where they were working, even on warm days. One by one, despite Thorne's threats and bonuses, workers began to quit, citing an unbearable atmosphere, a feeling of deep wrongness they couldn't shake. Thorne, now teetering on the edge of paranoia, began to suspect a conspiracy. He installed security cameras, but the footage revealed nothing but empty rooms and tools, seemingly moving on their own when replayed, or the cameras themselves would malfunction at crucial moments. He decided to stay overnight in the house himself, determined to catch whomever or whatever was sabotaging his grand design. He found no saboteurs. Instead, he experienced the oppressive silence, the sudden cold, the feeling of unseen eyes, and his own expensive watch, a symbol of his modern efficiency, stopping dead at precisely 3 a.m., its hands refusing to budge until he left the property. The climax of Oakhaven's quiet rebellion was not a dramatic confrontation, but a moment of profound, inexplicable structural failure. A newly poured concrete foundation for a modern glass extension, an addition that would have irrevocably altered the house's original footprint and character, developed a massive spiderweb crack literally overnight. Despite perfect weather conditions and adherence to all building codes, the ground beneath it became inexplicably waterlogged, as if a hidden spring had suddenly burst forth. Though engineers could find no source, defeated by mounting costs, endless delays, a non-existent workforce, and the sheer, unnerving weight of Oakhaven's persistent, passive resistance, Silas Thorne finally admitted defeat. The project was a disaster. He sold Oakhaven at a significant loss, his brief, dismissive warning to the new buyers about the house being temperamental, barely hinting at the truth of his ordeal. The new owners, a young couple with a passion for historical preservation, had heard whispers of Thorne's troubles, but they were drawn to Oakhaven's faded beauty and its palpable sense of history. They spoke openly of their plans to restore it, to honor Mrs. Ainsworth's legacy. And strangely, from the day they took possession, the unsettling occurrences ceased. Tools stayed where they were placed. Blueprints remained unaltered. The house seemed to sigh, not with sorrow, but with a quiet contentment. Oakhaven still stands, overlooking Willow Creek, its old timbers holding a silent testament. It serves as a quiet, chilling reminder that some places hold on to the love and intent of those who cherish them, and that a promise, once given, can become a force more resilient and more effectively vengeful than any fury. In the hallowed, often unforgiving halls of the art world, reputations can be as fragile as spun glass, and a single, well-placed word from a powerful voice can build a legacy or shatter it into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. This is a tale of such a shattering, and of a justice sought not through earthly courts or overt acts, but through the subtle, pervasive artistry of a spirit wronged. Seraphina Moon was an artist touched by a rare and ethereal grace. Her canvases seemed to breathe, to shimmer with an inner light that captured not just forms, but the very essence of fleeting emotions, the quiet melancholy of twilight, the fragile hope of dawn, the whispered secrets of ancient forests. Her style was unique, a delicate dance between realism and a dreamlike luminescence. She was a gentle soul, dedicated to her craft, living a life of quiet creation, her work only just beginning to attract the appreciative murmurs of those who valued originality and profound depth over fleeting trends. Then there was Alastair Finch. Finch was a titan in the world of art criticism, his pronouncements capable of anointing unknowns or banishing established names to obscurity. His pen was sharp, his opinions unyielding, his influence undeniable. He moved through galleries and auction houses with an air of supreme authority, his judgments often delivered with a theatrical flourish that belied a deep-seated arrogance. Perhaps he saw in Seraphina's burgeoning unique light a challenge to the established order he so carefully curated. Or perhaps his motives were born of a more personal, unacknowledged envy. Whatever the reason, Finch set his sights on Seraphina. With calculated precision, he launched a public and devastating critique of her latest, most promising exhibition. He didn't just criticize, he condemned. He accused her of plagiarism, of borrowing too heavily from an obscure symbolist painter of a century past, an accusation built on the thinnest of resemblances, twisted through the lens of his authoritative disdain. He wove a narrative of deceit, his influential words casting a dark shadow over Seraphina's genuine talent. The art world, ever susceptible to the pronouncements of figures like Finch, quickly followed his lead. Galleries that had once courted Seraphina now politely declined her calls. Collectors who had shown interest vanished. Whispers followed her, tainted by Finch's venom. Seraphina, whose spirit was as delicate as the light she painted, was crushed. She attempted to defend her work, to present the evidence of her unique process, her years of solitary development. But her quiet, earnest voice was no match for the established roar of Alastair Finch's reputation. Her art, born of such profound honesty, was now seen through a filter of suspicion. The joy of creation withered within her. She retreated from the world, her canvases left untouched, her light dimming. Within 2 years, Seraphina Moon passed away quietly, prematurely. Her name a footnote mired in unjust controversy. Her heart, it was said by the few who remained loyal, simply broken. Some time passed. Alastair Finch continued his reign, his pronouncements shaping tastes and fortunes. He was at the peak of his career, working on a new, definitive volume on contemporary art, a book intended to cement his legacy. It was then that the subtle haunting began, a revenge enacted not by a raging spectre, but by the very essence of art itself. Finch first noticed it in his own writing. As he typed, his carefully crafted sentences would sometimes shift. A phrase intended to praise a favored artist might inexplicably morph, its adjectives and verbs subtly rearranging themselves to describe, with uncanny accuracy, Serafina Moon's unique treatment of light and shadow. His attempts to define a new artistic movement would find themselves subtly undermined by clauses that echoed Serafina's own artistic philosophy, ideas he had once publicly ridiculed. At first, he blamed fatigue, a trick of the aging mind. He'd delete the offending phrases, retype, only to find them, or similar spectral edits reappearing later. Faintly, almost like a watermark on the digital page, he sometimes thought he could discern the delicate looping flourish of Serafina's signature. Then, the art around him began to change. In his private collection, a landscape by a celebrated impressionist started to exhibit a new, unsettling depth in its twilight hues, colors that were unmistakably from Serafina's preferred palette. A modern abstract he was championing began to develop faint, almost subliminal patterns in its textured surface. Patterns that, when squinted at in a certain light, resolved into a recurring motif from Serafina's last unfinished series, an ethereal, many-winged bird. Portraits of stern-faced industrialists he had acquired for investment seemed to soften, their gazes taking on a sorrowful, knowing quality he found increasingly reminiscent of Serafina's own gentle, perceptive eyes. These visual alterations were, at first, so subtle, so ephemeral, that Finch constantly doubted his own senses. He'd stare at a painting, convinced the color had shifted or new detail had emerged, only for it to seem normal again when he called his assistant in to verify. His colleagues, when he tentatively mentioned these anomalies, offered polite but dismissive smiles, suggesting a need for new glasses or a long vacation. He was alone with these quiet artistic rebellions. The third phase of Serafina's gentle siege was auditory. Finch began to hear music, faint and achingly beautiful, when he was alone in his study, surrounded by his books and art. It was a melancholic piano melody, a tune he had never heard before, yet it felt intimately familiar, resonating with the same ethereal quality that had defined Serafina's paintings. No one else heard it. His staff reported no source for the music. It would drift into his consciousness as he tried to write, its sorrowful beauty a constant, unnerving counterpoint to his increasingly fractured thoughts. The air in his office, too, sometimes seemed to carry a faint, elusive scent, a delicate blend of lavender and linseed oil, the very aromas that had always permeated Serafina's small studio. Alistair Finch, the man of unshakable pronouncements and ironclad certainty, began to unravel. His famed arrogance gave way to a gnawing unease, then to a quiet, consuming paranoia. He became obsessed with the subtle changes in the art around him, with the phantom music, with the words that were no longer entirely his own. He tried to find rational explanations. Then, in a desperate panic, he tried to hide the spectral alterations, moving paintings to storage, rewriting entire chapters of his book, only to find new, more insistent manifestations of Serafina's artistic spirit emerging elsewhere. His work, once his fortress, became his torment. His critiques grew erratic, his pronouncements confused. His once lauded prose now often lapsing into nonsensical tangents, or more disturbingly, into passages of unexpected, almost reverent praise for artists who worked in Serafina's overlooked tradition. His credibility as the art world's foremost arbiter began to wane. Galleries grew wary of his increasingly unpredictable judgments. Collectors began to seek other counsel. Alistair Finch was not driven to madness by a vengeful phantom's shriek, nor was his life ended by a spectral hand. Instead, he was slowly, meticulously unmade by the very art he had sought to control and diminish. Serafina Moon's spirit, it seemed, had found its revenge not in causing him pain, but in forcing him to live in a world utterly saturated by her truth, her undeniable talent. Her artistry, gentle yet relentless, supernaturally reasserted its value, turning Finch's own curated world into a living canvas of her vindication. He spent his final years a recluse, his grand collection of art gathering dust, his magnum opus unfinished. The whispers in the art world eventually turned from his downfall to a renewed interest in the almost forgotten work of Serafina Moon, sparked by the strange tales surrounding Finch's decline. Her paintings, when re-examined, seemed to glow with an even more profound and mysterious light. The revenge was complete, not in the destruction of a man, but in the quiet, inevitable resurrection of a truth, an artistry that refused to be silenced. There are places on this earth where the bond between a soul and the soil runs deeper than roots, where a lifetime of devotion imbues the land itself with a kind of sentience, a watchful, waiting spirit. When such a place is desecrated, when a sacred trust with nature is broken, the land itself may seek a quiet, patient, and deeply unsettling form of recompense. This is the story of Veridian, a garden of unparalleled beauty, and the subtle revenge it enacted upon those who sought to erase its heart. Veridian was not merely a garden. It was a living tapestry, woven over half a century by the loving, knowing hands of Miss Agnes Periwinkle. It sprawled behind her a BCCE topic summary, prompt, acknowledged, user input, content warning, TED, slightly ramshackle cottage, a riot of color, scent, and texture that defied formal landscaping rules, but possessed an almost magical harmony. Rare orchids bloomed in the gnarled embrace of ancient apple trees. Carpets of unusual, jewel-toned mosses thrived in shady nooks and winding paths, barely visible beneath fragrant herbs, led to secret clearings where forgotten, night-blooming flowers unfurled their petals to the moon. Miss Agnes, a botanist by training, but a green witch by soul, knew every plant by name, conversed with them in soft whispers, and felt their individual personalities as keenly as those of any human companion. Veridian was her sanctuary, her life's work, her most profound connection to the world. When Miss Agnes passed away peacefully in her 93rd year, her cottage and its extraordinary garden were put up for sale. Into this haven of natural artistry came the Granthams, Arthur and dear Deirdre, a couple whose aesthetic sensibilities were as modern and sterile as Veridian was wild and vibrant. They bought the property not for its unique charm or its botanical treasures, but for its desirable location and the potential to maximize its square footage. The garden, in their eyes, was not a wonder, but an overgrown, unmanageable nuisance, an old-fashioned relic that needed to be tamed, or rather, obliterated. Their plans were swift and brutal. Level the jungle, pave over a significant portion for an expansive, minimalist concrete patio, install a state-of-the-art outdoor kitchen, and replace the remaining greenery with artificial turf and a few strategically placed, low-maintenance, ornamental shrubs in severe geometric planters. Of Veridian soul, its history, its delicate ecosystem, they gave not a single thought. The neglect began almost immediately. The intricate watering system Miss Agnes had devised fell silent. Prized delicate perennials withered under the Grantham's indifferent gaze. Weeds, common and thuggish, began to encroach upon the rare and the beautiful. Then came the uprooting. Workmen, hired by the Granthams, began to tear out sections of the garden. Their shovels and mattocks an affront to the decades of loving cultivation. The work was described by one, a BCC topic summary, prompt, acknowledged, user input, content, warning, dead neighbor as an assault. Each torn root, each discarded bloom like a small death. Veridian visibly suffered, its vibrant colors dulling, its joyful chorus of birdsong diminishing. Yet, even in its decline, a strange quiet resilience seemed to emanate from the soil. Then, the garden's subtle retaliation began, seeping from the violated earth and into the Grantham's newly acquired home. It started indoors. Tenacious pale green vines, unlike anything that had grown in Veridian before, began to sprout from the tiniest, almost invisible cracks in the cottage walls, around window frames, even from the grouting between bathroom tiles. They were disturbingly difficult to remove, snapping off only to reappear, longer and more insistent within days. At first, the Granthams blamed old plumbing or dampness. But the vines were dry, almost papery to the touch, and seemed to thrive without water or light. An inexplicable, persistent smell began to permeate the house. It wasn't the scent of active decay, but a cloying, overly sweet floral aroma, like the phantom blooms of Miss Agnes's most cherished, now destroyed, night-fragrant jasmine, mixed with the heavy, damp smell of disturbed earth and fallen leaves. No amount of air freshener, open windows, or professional cleaning could dispel it. It clung to their clothes, their hair, a constant suffocating reminder of the garden they were attempting to erase. Unusual insects too began to make their presence known inside the cottage. Not common household pests, but large, beautifully patterned moths that would beat against the window panes at night. Iridescent beetles that Miss Agnes had once catalogued with delight, now found congregating in silent, unnerving clusters in the corners of rooms. They caused no harm, but their silent, out-of-place presence was deeply unsettling. The Granthams themselves were not spared. Their sleep became troubled by vivid, oppressive dreams. Deirdre would wake in a cold sweat, convinced she was entangled in massive, suffocating vines, their tendrils tightening around her limbs. Arthur dreamt of being lost in an endless, overgrown jungle, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and unseen blossoms, the rustling of leaves, an ever-present menacing sound. During their waking hours, they'd sometimes feel the phantom brush of a leaf against their skin when nothing was there, or the imaginary prickle of thorns. Faint sounds began to drift through the house. The rustle of leaves when the air was still, the soft, almost inaudible humming of a simple tune Miss Agnes often sang while tending her plants. The distinct chirping of crickets that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, even in broad daylight. The very structure of the cottage started to yield to this quiet, green rebellion. The Granthams knew expensive, minimalist wallpaper began to peel in damp curling strips, as if the walls themselves were sweating. Polished wooden floors developed a strange greenish tinge in patches, or a fine, resilient layer of what looked like moss would appear overnight in shaded corners, only to return with unnerving speed when scrubbed away. Their stark modern furniture began to look out of place, almost rejected by the house, as if it were being slowly reclaimed by a wilder, older aesthetic. The newly laid concrete patio outside began to develop hairline cracks, from which impossibly resilient, unfamiliar weeds with disturbingly strong roots would push their way through. Patches of unnaturally vibrant green moss spread across the pristine gravel of their new, low-maintenance yard with astonishing speed. The constant, losing battle against this encroaching, unnatural naturalness. The pervasive, unsettling atmosphere within the cottage, and the unceasing psychological toll of the strange occurrences began to wear the Granthams down. Their dream of a sleek, modern, easily managed property was being systematically, quietly, and relentlessly composted before their very eyes. The house, it seemed, was actively trying to digest their sterile vision and return to the wild, verdant spirit of Veridian. Exhausted, unnerved, and with their renovation budget bleeding away on inexplicable repairs and failed attempts to control the infestations, the Granthams made a decision. They couldn't live there. They couldn't fight a battle against an enemy they couldn't see. An enemy that seemed to be the very essence of the place itself. They put the property back on the market. Their grand plans for modernization abandoned. Their spirits as blighted as the few remaining patches of their artificial turf. The narrator might conclude, nature possesses a memory, and sometimes a will as deep and tenacious as the oldest roots. Veridian, or perhaps the lingering essence of Miss Agnes woven into its soil and stems, did not rage. It simply, patiently, reclaimed its own, enacting a slow, green, and ultimately absolute revenge on those who fail to understand that some beauty is not meant to be tamed, but cherished. The last I heard, the cottage stood empty for a time. The garden slowly, determinedly, beginning to creep back towards its former glory, sighing its earthy fragrance into the quiet air, waiting, perhaps, for hands that would understand its heart.